So at any interest rate, the central bank chooses to force. It is relatively easy for the central bank to peg the interest rate on short-term government debt instruments by standing ready to purchase it at a fixed price in unlimited quantities. This is precisely what the Fed did in the United States until 1951, providing banks with an interest rate alternative to excess reserves, but at a very low rate of interest. The Treasury-Fed Accord of 1951 ended the Fed's official commitment to managing rates on behalf of the Treasury, but it did not usurp its power to do so. Indeed, the Federal Reserve retains the ability to move rates lower even if deficits soar. It's a reality that should be obvious to any casual observer of Fed policy over the last decade. When the bottom fell out of the U.S. economy in 2008, the budget deficit rocketed to more than 10% of GDP. As deficits climbed, the Federal Reserve cut the overnight rate to zero and held it there for 7 straight years. In addition, the Fed conducted 3 rounds of quantitative easing, buying U.S. Treasuries and mortgage-backed securities, which allowed the Fed to push long-term interest rates down as well. Anyone who tells you that fiscal deficits must force interest rates higher has forgotten their World War II history and ignored recent experience, and not just in the United States. Since 2016, Japan's central bank has been explicitly targeting its yield curve. That means the BOJ isn't just controlling the overnight interest rate, as the Fed does in the US, but also effectively setting long term rates as well. The practice is known as yield curve control because it literally involves controlling the yield on 10-year government bonds. Today, the BOJ is committed to holding the 10-year rate at around 0%. To do that, the central bank simply buys bonds in whatever quantities necessary to prevent yields from rising above zero. It's a bit akin to quantitative easing, and that lowering interest rates are their objective. However, yield curve control is a stronger form of commitment, since the quantity of bonds the BOJ will buy in a given time period is not determined ahead of time. Yield curve control is about committing to an interest rate, price, target rather than committing to a purchased certain amount, quantity, of bonds. The BOJ's policy clearly demonstrates that the central bank can set both about short-term and long-term interest rates, even as government borrowing rises. By exercising its power as a sovereign currency issuer, Japan can always prevent the kind of interest rate pressure imagined in the loanable funds story. Not every country has these powers. As Fulwiler explains, quote, the implications for economic policy are paradigm shifting for monetary sovereigns, end quote. To put it simply, the crowding out story doesn't work in countries that borrow in their own sovereign currencies. For the United States, Japan, the United Kingdom, and other monetary sovereigns, the interest rate on the national debt is a policy variable. As currency issuers, they don't need to borrow their own currency in order to spend. Bond sales are entirely voluntary, and the interest rates paid on any bonds the government chooses to offer is always a policy choice. That's not true of countries that lack monetary sovereignty. Countries like Greece and Italy, along with other 17 members of the Eurozone, gave up their sovereign currencies in order to use the euro. Since they can't issue the euro, member governments must cover fiscal deficits by selling bonds. That means finding investors who are willing to give up euros in exchange for government debt. The problem is that lending to these countries become especially risky once they started promising to repay bondholders in a currency they could no longer issue themselves. This became painfully clear in the wake of the 2008 financial crisis, as a global recession pushed the budgets of Greece and other Eurozone countries deeply into deficit. To finance their deficits, each country had to seek funding in a marketplace not entirely unlike that imagined in the crowding out story. Governments had no choice but to borrow in private financial markets, and they had to pay whatever the market demanded to secure the funding they needed. Investors were rightly worried about lending to governments that could no longer guarantee repayment. To compensate for the added risk they were taking, financial markets demand higher and higher interest rates. Before long, a full-blown debt crisis unfolded. In Greece, the poster child for the crisis, interest rates on 10-year government bonds skyrocketed from 4.5% in September 2008 to nearly 30% by February 2012. Eventually, the currency issuer, the European Central Bank (ECB), came to their rescue and interest rates moved sharply lower. Borrowing in a currency they couldn't issue opened to Eurozone nations up to the kind of interest rate pressures predicted in the conventional crowding out story. Something similar tends to happen when countries tether the value of their domestic currencies to gold or tie them to other currency. That is, fix their exchange rates. Russia and Argentina, for example, once pledged to convert their domestic currencies, rubles and pesos, respectively, into US dollars at a fixed exchange rate. The problem is that in order to defend the exchange rate peg, the government has to give up control of the interest rate. Here's what happened in Russia. You could hold the domestic currency, the ruble, or you could ask the central bank to convert your rubles into something else. You could swap your rubles for US dollars at the fixed exchange rate, or you could use your rubles to buy Russian government bonds, known as GKOs, as Forstater and Mosler observed, quote, government securities can be thought of as a competing with a conversation to US dollars option, end quote. As long as most people were willing to hold rubles or GKOs, things worked pretty well. The Russian government could issue both, but all hell broke loose in 1998 when suddenly everyone wanted US dollars. As demand for GKOs evaporated, the price of Russian bonds collapsed, and yields rose sharply, just as the Greek government was incapable of preventing a spike in borrowing costs. Countries that fixed their exchange rates sacrificed control of the interest rates. From an MMT perspective, quote, this explains the very high interest rates paid by governments with perceived default risk and fixed exchange rate regimes, in contrast to the ease a nation such as Japan has in keeping rates at zero and a floating exchange rate regime, despite deficits that would undermine a fixed exchange rate regime. Unquote. The lesson is simple. Currency regime matters. The simple crowding out story was built for a world that no longer exists. Yet conventional economic theory treats the sequence of falling dominoes as an inevitable consequence of deficit spending. The truth is that story has limited applicability. As Timothy Sharp put it, quote, financial crowding out theory was initially proposed and analyzed in the context of a convertible currency system. That is a gold standard in the Bretton Woods Fixed Exchange Rate Agreement, 1946 to 71. Taking into account different currency regimes changes everything. That's what Sharp discovered in a sweeping empirical investigation where he separated countries that fit the MMT model, that is, those with monetary sovereignty, from those that fix their exchange rates or borrow in a foreign currency. Consistent with MMT, he concluded that, quote, the empirical evidence reveals crowding out efforts in non-sovereign economies, but not within sovereign economies, end quote. In other words, it's a mistake to apply the crowding out story to monetary sovereigns like the US, Japan, the UK, or Australia. The truth is, government deficits aren't the villains of progress. They don't make it harder for the private sector to borrow and invest. In almost all cases, they make it easier. That's because Uncle Sam's deficits feed dollars into our bucket. Whether these dollars arrive in the form of tax cuts or increased spending, they leave some of us with greater spending power, and spending is the lifeblood of capitalism. Without it, business would have no customers, no sales revenue, and no profits to keep them afloat. Thus, Nobel Peace Prize winning economist William Vickery put it, well-targeted deficits, quote, will generate added disposable income, enhance the demand for the product of industry, and make private investment more profitable, end quote. In other words, well-designed fiscal policies, including those that increase fiscal deficits, can catalyze private investment, sparking a virtuous cycle that leads to the crowding out of private investment rather than crowding it out. I thank you guys for watching. I just wanted to finish chapter 4 real quick before I head off to do other things. Um, Hope you guys enjoyed that. I did talk fast just so I could get it done. We are getting some housework done, so with people going in and out, I wanted to make sure I could be quiet but also get the last half of chapter 4 finished. Other than that, hope you guys have a great day.